episode of Beyond Focus TV. I'm Lydia Patel, and as always, I have a very special guest for you, Brian Cunningham, who's a Democrat for City Council of the 40th District. He'll be with us tonight for the next 30 minutes, so stay with us. You're watching Beyond Focus TV.
Beyond Focus TV allows you to discuss contemporary topics affecting the Caribbean people on both a national and local level. The show features informed guests who offer insight, debate, and evaluate various issues. Beyond Focus TV builds on the station's mission to provide useful information to the Caribbean people in New York and abroad. Beyond Focus TV, where our viewing audience can get educated, informed, and empowered.
Welcome back. You're watching Beyond Focus TV. I'm Lydia Patel. Like I said, I have a very special guest for you. I'm pleased to have Brian Cunningham, Democrat for the 40th District.
How are you doing?
How are you? It's great to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's a very busy time. It's important to have you here, and I want everyone to really pay attention because especially if you're in the 40th District, this episode is especially for you. You're going to want to pay particular attention here tonight. But Brian, let's kind of go straight into it, kind of talk about who you are. Give us a little bit of background info before we even touch the politics.
Don't touch politics yet?
Brian Cunningham?
That is a question every voter's asking. Well, I was born and raised in East Flatbush. My mother is a Jamaican immigrant. I'm a first-generation American.
Beautiful.
My mother came to New York in the 1970s, 1975. She often tells me she came here thinking that the country was covered with, paved with gold. She landed in February, was covered in snow. So she came to a very cold winter surprise. Her first night in this country, she arrived and the person who picked her up from the airport didn't pick her up. She ended up in the Bronx for a day, and then she found her way to this magical place called Brooklyn. What she noticed about Brooklyn that she loved, and I think a lot of people are starting to love about Brooklyn, was there were 2 hospitals, 2 train stations that were very close proximity, and a church. So she figured if she got sick, she can go to the hospitals. If she needed to get to work, the trains were there, and then she had this church to anchor her faith. She really came here as like most immigrants, right, for a better life, for a future generation. She didn't have kids yet, but she knew that if she was going to raise kids, she'd want them raised in a place like America. My sister and I grew up in East Flatbush, and you know, we spent most of our lives in public service. My sister's a teacher. I got into public service. I used to be working education as an advocate counselor in high schools, serving kids who were 16 and 21 who were overage and unaccredited. And while I was working in those schools, I noticed that a lot of kids were underserved by our public policy and under-resourced by our city council's discretionary funding. I tried to get a job in politics. It didn't work out in the city council the first time, but I got a job with a great guy by the name of State Senator Kevin Parker, who gave me a chance to be his campaign manager and the special assistant. Did that for a couple of years, had an opportunity from there to work in the city council as a chief of staff. And then after that, worked in housing. I worked in small business services, the director of small business services. And last year, I had the privilege to work for President Obama's My Brother's Keepers Alliance, working to close the gap for 5 million young people who are out of work and not in school. So I've had a long career in a relatively short lifespan.
Absolutely. I would definitely say that. You know, you've done quite a bit. You covered a lot of ground. Yeah. So how would you say, being a first generation, someone like myself, parents or immigrants who came here, how has that really shaped you? Because I find it shapes you, it really does play a part in who we are.
Yeah.
And how we, even our political views.
Yeah. So I think for me, it's, my mom really focused on this idea of hard work, right? And you had to be better than everybody else. So in school, I always had to excel. Like a 90 wasn't enough for my mother. My mother wanted 95s and 100s, right? She always wanted to kick it up another notch. But it also shaped me growing up in an area that was largely Caribbean and seeing people who were strivers and people who were trying to strive and make better for their community, but were limited sometimes because they spoke with an accent or because they didn't come from wealth or because they grew up in a different place and sometimes were living under the shadows of immigration and not really having their papers, so to speak, worked out. So I think it's always shaped my mind to be more inclined to work harder, but also to work smarter to make sure that I got in a position to help those who were coming behind me.
Exactly, and that's something I was leading into. A lot of times, we all know somebody who wasn't straight, didn't have their stuff, and I guess that shapes, I don't want to say it's normal, but for us it's we have a different tolerance than people who family may have been here
Sure.
for hundreds of years and never even have to know where 26 Federal Plaza is.
Yeah. Or where Bobby's was. Like you say Bobby's, it's a code word for Little Macy's in Flatbush, right?
Of course.
But a lot of folks who grew up here for generations walk by it all the time and don't realize that's actually a place where we go to shop to send things back home. And a lot of our resources went to paying bills, right? And after pay bills, you sent the barrel back home and you sent the money grant back home. So it's always been a community that's always looked out. Not only for the next generation, their own kin, but always looked out for other people who were back home and still struggling.
So at what point did you really decide that you wanted to really make a career in politics?
You know what? I want to make a career in public service. Politics was the end goal in terms of you have to get elected through a political process.
Very true.
But for me, it's always been about public service. And I really made a decision, again, working in the high schools, working with those kids who were 16 and 21. I saw so much promise and so much potential in their eyes. I saw a lot of young people who oftentimes didn't have a hot meal in the morning before they came to school. So it wasn't that they weren't smart enough. They went to what was called a transfer high school, which essentially means that they were overage for their current grade level or undercredited for their grade level. And for me, it was really making sure that whatever disparity gaps they had, whether it would be financial, social, or social economics, that we close those gaps. And just working in those schools really, really pushed me, made me see some of the best situations, some of the worst situations, and also opportunities in all those situations. So that was really what was the driving force around 2007, was when it happened. And in 2007, that same year, a guy with a funny name ran for president. You remember that guy, Barack Obama, Hussein Obama? And when he ran for president and won, and working in that campaign over the summer really, I think, kicked this dream into high gear because we saw a reality of the dream coming true. It wasn't just like your parents telling you, you can be anything you want to be, a doctor, a lawyer, the president. You're like, yeah, okay, Mom, whatever. But actually seeing a man of color occupy the Oval Office, a black man occupy the Oval Office, definitely kicked that dream into high gear. And again, that's when I started looking for opportunities in the political space to see how I can make larger changes.
And again, for the local aspect, that's something you wanted to do because you directly have the ability. I think local politics, it's kind of underrated.
It was kind of a selfish thing, right, in some sense, right? I think for me, I'm very community-based. So I wanted a job that would allow me to come home every night, but at the same time, allow me to serve a large community. The 40th Council District represents 182,000 people, which is larger. If you go to other states, essentially I become a mayor or a governor in some states, right? But in the city council, you have a $86 billion budget with a B to overlook. You have legislation that you could pass, but you're also shepherding and fighting on behalf of 182,000 people, and you still get to come home every night. And I think the perspective of that is like going to your local supermarket in Flatbush and kind of seeing the immigrant family who's struggling to pay for groceries, going to Prospect Levitt's Gardens and seeing the family who's seen rent increase 80% over the last 10 years, going to Dipness Park and hearing the stories of homeowners, really kind of keeps you grounded and keeps you in touch with what's going on. Not saying the folks in Albany or the folks in Washington aren't as in touch, but certainly coming home and dealing with it every night, or somebody saying to you like, hey Brian, I know you're running for city council, here's my issues, or hey council member, here's my issues after September. I think that changes your perspective a lot, and it makes you go into that chamber and fight a little harder.
Absolutely. And for those who don't know, let's talk about all the areas that are really represented by the 40th District.
Yeah, so if you live in Flatbush, East Flatbush, Dipness Park, Prospect Levitt's Gardens, Prospect Park South, and a little piece of Crown Heights, I might just be your representative in City Hall.
All right, absolutely. Well, that's a really, really good. We're going to take a quick break. Be right back. You're watching Beyond Focus TV. We're coming up with so much more, so don't go anywhere. Watching Beyond Focus TV. I'm Lydia Patel, sitting here with Brian Cunningham. So Brian, let's talk a little bit about your mandate.
Yep.
Now let's really kind of let everyone at home
dig in there.
Kind of dig in. Why should we vote for you? People in the 40th District, they're going to be voting.
Yeah.
Why?
So I think the first part is we have to look at what the issues are, right? And I think let's underscore those. I think I said it in the first part of this interview, but I'll say it again. Housing is probably the biggest crisis happening in Brooklyn right now. And it's not a situation that's just germane to the 40th Council District, but it's certainly something that has taken full effect in the 40th. We have, at this moment, rents that have gone up 80% in the last 10 years. And I say 10 years because that's a term of the current council member. He's been in the chamber for 10 years, and we've seen rent go up 80%. When you walk along Flatbush Avenue, Rogers Avenue, Bedford Avenue, you walk through some of those small businesses. A lot of those small businesses are closed because commercial tenants have pushed up prices beyond the point where people can afford to make payroll and afford to keep their business open. You look at youth services. We have a number of schools that could be open after 3 o'clock to alleviate some of the police-student conflicts, to alleviate some of the teen pregnancy issues, to add some extracurricular activities where there have been none in the existing curriculum. And our schools are closed because of a lack of resources. You look at seniors like my mom who got here in the 1970s, whose paychecks are now on the decline, are beginning to live on set wages or stagnated wages. And the cost of living just continue to rise. So I think at this point in the city council, we need more than just a council member who's going to show up for votes, but we need someone who's going to show up with action, solutions, and with some grit and some fight to fight for the residents of the district. And I think that's something that I'm prepared to do on day one. One, because I have a background that has been in City Hall for a long time as a chief of staff. I've worked in the state legislature as a special assistant. I worked in the federal government. I also worked in nonprofit. So I get these issues, as well as being a resident, a longtime resident of this district. So those are things I bring to the job on day one that I think our current member has not brought to the job. And I think even the other folks who are in this race don't have the depth of experience and also the new ideas to fix some of these complex problems. So those are things I'm bringing to the chamber on day one.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Funny story, because I was with a friend of mine, we're at the supermarket, and you always see people with their EBT card.
Yeah.
And people who are working but don't qualify for them.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'll walk out of there with one bag and it'd be like, or 2 bags, and it'd be like $30, $40.
Sure.
But everyone else would have cart full, like people, and it's just a disparity. It really, there's so much things that don't make sense.
Listen, I think it comes down to, it becomes a decision-making process at the supermarket line after you pay your rent. Because the first thing people pay is their rent, right? For the most part. If you have any wisdom, you want to make sure that you have somewhere to live. But then beyond that, it's looking at where can you pay for food and what you got to cut out of your diet, or eating healthy versus cheaper foods that are non-nutritious but are more affordable. So these are like tough decisions that people have to make on a daily basis that you really shouldn't have to make in a country as rich as America, in a city as rich as America.
So fresh produce,
oh God, poor
and
you.
all those things. I'm leaving with nothing. When I'm talking about 2 bags, I've just paid $40 for
You get an apple and a banana.
And I'm like, what did I get?
What did I get? Herbal tea.
So it's really, you've seen the change. I lived throughout Brooklyn, and I've definitely seen it. And it's unless you're fortunate enough to have stabilized rent.
Sure. And even those units are coming off the market, right? Rent stabilization is under attack. We're seeing even increases being proposed there, upward to 8%.
Wow.
So, again, I understand the importance of a landlord offsetting some of their expenses as well, right? Water taxes have gone up in the city. Taxes have gone up in the city. And part of the reason why taxes have gone up for landlords, right, even some landlords who are good actors, is because of our 421A laws in Albany, right, which gives a tax abatement to people who build affordable housing, which isn't affordable for most people who live in our communities, but they get a tax abatement to do that while we shoulder the burden of those taxes now to people who own their homes. So they can afford to pay their mortgage, but they can't pay their water bill, they can't pay their land tax, and unfortunately they're being pushed out of their homes, and that's just not acceptable.
So what could really be done about this housing issue? Because this is something very serious.
Sure.
I mean, people writing about this topic, this is something that's always coming up. Like you said, this is no surprise.
Yeah.
Rents are going up. Certain areas are just unaffordable.
So I have a 3-part solution to this. The first part of the solution is, one, we have to begin to look at the zoning. The city council has the most influence over the city's zoning laws, right? So we can zone areas and down zone areas are contextually zone areas to fit the communities, and that helps. The second part is we got to begin to develop what's called at-cost development. A lot of people don't talk about this. At-cost development means we're not looking at for-profit developers. We're looking at nonprofit developers, work with nonprofit organizations to create housing. So what you essentially do is you create housing at a cost. If it costs $200,000 to build the units of housing, then you can only charge up to $200,000 for those units, opposing to all these surpluses that create profit margins that are beyond what it costs to develop and